Ready? So these are some metal slabs, but they're interesting metal slabs. Interesting because these slabs represent the most highly anticipated, probably, devices that are going to come out soon. On the right-hand side over here, we have the next generation Galaxy Note represented, and then over here is the entire Apple lineup. Well, now the iPhone is a little bit less interesting because I've already kind of profiled it. We had the clone version as well, which actually what probably isn't all that close to the eventual iPhone 11. These are likely a lot closer, especially when it comes to the camera implementation. But then I haven't actually looked at or held the next generation Note format. So over here, for the first time ever, you're going to have two versions of the Galaxy Note series. You're going to have the standard Note 10 and then the Note 10 Plus, which gets even bigger. And compared to the max version of the next-gen iPhone, what you'll notice if I flip it around, it's substantially more screen, especially in the height department. Now, if you look at this closely, what you'll notice is this tiny, tiny little representation of where the frame will be. And instead, this is going to have glass that wraps around right to this tip of this edge right here. And it's going to be glass, of course, on the front and the back. So, presumably, you'll have a display that stretches from the very far corner, top corner, to the very far bottom. Whereas, in Apple's case, you're working with a bit of a bezel. And then, of course, you're still going to maintain the current version, or at least something very close to the current version of the Face ID notch that exists. Whereas, in Samsung's case, it looks like they're going to have the smallest hole punch setup that they've ever had implemented. This is scaled down quite significantly from what we're currently looking at, especially on the S10 Plus, which has the larger dual front-facing camera hole punch. I don't know, it's probably half the size of the hole punch on the standard version Galaxy S10. So what does that mean for you? It just means a whole lot more screen in this form factor. Now, weirdly enough, it gets a bit confusing as far as which one of these you're supposed to go to, because like I said, in the past, the Note series was perceived already as a professional option, as a kind of pro version of the S range. Like you had the S10 or S9 previously, and then you had the Note series for maybe even slightly bigger battery, slightly bigger display, and then the pen input. But now you've got two versions of it, so it might get a bit confusing for customers. That said, options are always good. But the standard Note series, size-wise, still the screen is somewhere in the same territory as the Max version of the iPhone, though it does look to be slightly more narrow. But then in your hand, it feels tiny comparatively to the Max version of the iPhone. And that's because of this very sharp edge they've been able to engineer. Again, this is going to feel likely even better when you have the glass-metal combination. But even right now, I mean, this feels way smaller than my OnePlus 7 Pro. This feels smaller than most flagships I've held in a while. So then you're like, okay, I guess there's a portability component. There's a single-handed functionality component to the smaller size Note. But when it comes to Note users in general, I have to believe they're going to gravitate towards the bigger one, because, you know, typically that's the reason to go for this particular device, is kind of to get the biggest form factor that's out there, especially when you consider using the pen. If you're into using the pen, then you can, you know, it's going to be a two-handed scenario anyway. So anyhow, we're going to see two versions. I don't think there's going to be any kind of performance difference between these two from a spec perspective, beyond the fact that the bigger one will obviously get a bigger display and a bigger battery to go with that bigger display, maybe a few extra pixels on that display as well. But otherwise, I think you're going to see similar chips inside, similar performance specs. So it'll just come down to that. And then, oh, and also maybe you'll see the bigger charger, the higher wattage charger go with the Pro version, the Plus version, whatever it is they happen to call it. Okay, now on the Apple side over here, this for the first time, at least for me, is this is the first time I've seen all three of the potential iPhone 11s together in the same spot. The Max is the only one I played with in the mock-up and the clone version. And it's a familiar size. It's basically the same specification size-wise as the current version. It's very close. The camera cutout, it's controversial. People have different opinions on it. Jack thinks it looks terribly ugly. I think people will probably get used to it as they normally do with Apple devices. Apple had to go and do some re-engineering here. They had to advance to a certain degree because all these other manufacturers are sticking more cameras on. They had to do something. But what they did scale-wise is they made the cheap model, the R model, which is represented in the center here, will likely only have 2 cameras. They made it in between the two from a scale perspective. So as you can see, it scales up accordingly here. This being the standard version of the iPhone 11, feeling somewhat small by today's standards. This would be the R represented here in the middle, and then we have the big boy on the far end of the spectrum. Should I get a measuring tape? The standard version iPhone 11 model over here coming in diagonal measurement at around, what do we have here? About 5 3/4 inches measured diagonally, somewhere in that territory. The budget R version, of course, going to be a bit larger there. You're going to have, similar to the current model probably, it's looking around 6 inches. And the biggest max version of the next generation iPhone is going to measure around 6.5 diagonally. Now, where things get interesting, in my opinion, is on the Note side, because as I mentioned, you have the display really moving around the edge of the device, so you kind of have to measure it almost from the very corner to corner. And in this form factor, I mean, you're measuring close to 6.5 on the little Note series. And when you hold these two together, they feel like totally different size phones, just because of the way Apple treats the edge of the device comparatively. You can see this one is thinner and it feels more narrow, so it just is a lot more comfortable for one-handed use. And then if you go up to the big guy, the Pro Plus version of the Note, things get even crazier. It's almost 7 inches diagonally on this device, and it feels, I would say, it doesn't feel all that much bigger than the max version of the iPhone. So if you're a power user and you're looking for the kind of ultimate screen to body ratio, the ultimate screen that you can get in a package that's manageable, I think there's no doubt here that this particular implementation on the Samsung side is going to give you more screen for your scale. And that's not even factoring in the bezel and the notch, which is, of course, occupying some of the real estate. All right, so there you have it, represented in their metallic structures, the future of flagship smartphones from Apple and Samsung. And now I guess you get to select, you get to tell me which one it is that you're waiting for or most excited for. Man, the stuff is stacking up. I would say at this point, I am pretty confident that these here are very close representations of the eventual devices based on what's leaked up until this point, and the fact that this type of stuff is showing up at the studio to begin with. I think Apple users are going to have to become happy with this particular camera implementation, because I don't see some other version happening anytime soon.